I don't think that anyone of us on this call or on this show today would expect an athlete to not train ahead of time and walk on the field and give their best when it mattered most. When often we hear about training and preparing ahead of time, I think all of us can agree that 1,000 hours of going into something creates perfection. Now, that's what we want to talk about today on Consider This Program. How can we prepare? How can we train? How can we be ready for retirement before it comes through retirement practice year? We're looking forward to discuss that here with you today. Welcome to the show, Consider This Program. I'm Grant Soliven, co-host. Alongside of me today is Joseph Clark, our managing partner. Joe, we have so much fun when doing these together, and it's a blast when we have other team members on as well. Today, kind of looking at what we're discussing in this moment, it's your retirement practice year. Being in the industry as long as I have, I've not really heard of other firms doing this because, again, we take a look at, we rely so much on software and other annuity products, et cetera, to kind of land the plane for families, but preparing ahead of time is so important. And so when we talk about retirement practice year, let's kind of start here. Why is it important, and what are some of the things we need to be focusing on when we say things like standard of living?
Well, one is helping people understand that you walked through a process. You know, you played rugby, and, you know, I played football and wrestled. And, you know, when we walked into a weight room for the very first time, we couldn't lift a lot of weight.
Right.
We had no idea what we were doing.
Right.
And we probably didn't have the best, what they would call form, where we could have easily harmed ourselves as we got stronger and stronger and stronger. If we didn't have the right form, when we're doing squats and deadlifts and benching, bad things really could have happened.
Sure.
Right? The same is really true as people prepare for retirement. You go into that accumulation mode first, right? So you can make some pretty pathetic mistakes, right? When you're investing $100 a month, or, you know, when you've got $10,000 in your 401k, you can afford to get it wrong and learn some things because, for all intents and purposes, you're losing a lighter weight, right?
Right.
Now, the problem is eventually, because of defined contribution plans, that 401k gets to a size where you've now got some pretty heavy weights in your hands, right? And you've got to make decisions that can be, well, let's face it, either very rewarding or very detrimental, regardless of which way you went. You have to have somebody who's there helping you use that right form and make the right decisions in terms of where you are. Now, we're moving into a world that we have spent the last 25 years on in the Financial Enhancement Group, and that's helping people go through distribution.
Yes.
You've now done it. You've done the exercise. You've prepared. You've practiced. Now it's time to take the money out, whether you want to or not. Remember, the IRS is going to force that. That's why it's called required minimum distribution at some ages. But what we're going to talk to you about when it's time for you to be able to retire really is standard of living. Right. And so when, you know, and going to you athletes, right, when you go back to the gym, maybe you can only run an 8-minute mile now. Maybe you can only hike 10 miles on a hike. But you were doing 20 miles a day. Right.
Right.
And so much of the stuff that comes out of the academic world says, well, you need to do a certain percentage of what you did before you retired. And what we know as professional financial planners and people who've done this for a long time is you do not need a certain percentage of your income. What you need is 100% of what's required for your standard of living. So walk us through what would you call a standard of living? How would you help me at 54 years old, 55 years old? Things change. How would you help me understand what my standard of living is, and how would I look at it?
Absolutely. And Joe, when we take a look at standard of living, it's really simple when you break it out into two categories. So fixed expenses and social expenses. Going back to what they talk about in academia, when they're training us as CFPs, when we're doing this type of study, we have to take essentially 3% of your taxable income and inflation by 3% and grow that over time. And then if you all remember those TV commercials from AIG back in the day, people carrying around their dollar sign, remember that? What is your money? How much is it worth? It predisposed us to incorrect thinking because now you had to go back and create this number. What was it? And then you backfill your retirement from there. But when you do 100% standard of living, you break it out between fixed expenses and social expenses. The calculation becomes far more manageable for our families, especially when we say we're replacing 100%, not 70% of your taxable income. So fixed expenses are essentially those things that we can't live without, right? Utilities, cell phone, For some individuals, that's the golf membership, right? Also, when entertainment for grandkids, some people call it a fixed expense. We're not going to tell you how to spend your money. That's not our job. But we want you to factor in what are the things you can't live without. And then those fixed expenses, haircuts, medical, etc., we take those and we inflate those over the inflation rate because we know those aren't going away. But social, we actually tell families, Joe, don't be conservative with that number. Be liberal with that number. Pump it up. See how high it goes. Because once you know what that social number is, what we have found in our practice for all the families that we serve is around age 70, you begin to spend less socially because it's just too hard to get away from grandkids. It's just too hard to get away from a doctor. And man, Joe, recliners these days, whoo, they are comfy. So when we take a look at breaking down standard of living and what it actually looks like, those are the key costs that we want to evaluate. Fixed and social. We inflate fixed because of inflation, and social we know deteriorates, and it really helps our families achieve the goal they're trying to achieve.
And what I think is interesting is one of the things that's interesting is people really don't get the impact of inflation on purchasing power and how important it is. Right. So Grant just told you that he was trained academically to put in 3%, and I bet you that's what the CFP manuals that he's studying today say.
That's darn right.
In 1994, when I started the CFP program, it was 3.86. And the problem is inflation has been such a moot point for so long that people do not understand with Social Security. It's 5.9% is what the raise in Social Security is this next year.
Oh, absolutely.
Inflation is a big deal. If you get that assumption wrong, bad things can really happen in your financial journey. And one of the things Grant's going to teach you inside of the office, if you have one of the Next Steps meetings, is he will talk to you about how we adjust every 3 years based on not assumptions, but what really happened. And so that retirement practice year is about you having a fixed budget and a social budget, right? We don't know what the market's going to do. We don't know what inflation's going to do. We don't know what the tax rates are going to do, right? All of those variables will count in that entire deal. But over the course of the next 3 years, Grant or Aaron or Dean or Jamie, whomever you're seeing on the Financial Enhancement Group team, will help you modify and adjust so that you have a clearer vision going forward. What we really want is that cascading clarity for you to understand what your financial journey is going to look like with as much certainty as we can provide and not a bunch of garbage. Right. So there's an important part of this that you need to understand. And when you get into studying and working in distribution, one of the high-level academic terms that we use is sequence of risk, right? And sequence of return. So why don't you walk people through how we deal with that and what it is?
Sure. And actually, Joe, I love that and earlier we talked about in accumulation, you can have a couple boo-boos along the way, right? Once we get into distribution, those boo-boos become very, very powerful and sometimes irreversible mistakes. So this is one of them. So sometimes we have families come in and say, hey, this is my return. This is what my return's been the last 10 years. This is how much I'm going to take out of my account. Ooh, let's pump the brakes for a second, because what sequence of return tells us, and we have this, I guess we could have this visual for people if they wanted to see it, but believe it or not, if you had $1 million in 2000, and you took out $50,000 a year for income.
That's 5%, in case you're not doing math well.
Thank you. 5%, I would have been one of those people early on. You will actually, mathematically, based on the S&P 500, be broke by the end of 2019.
All right, so let's say this again, because somebody just wrecked their car, and we're not in the business of wrecking cars or retirement.
That's true.
Right? So understand what he said. The S&P 500 has had an average return of greater than 5% per year. That is true. That's what you hear on TV. That's what you hear in the media. It's had an average return of greater than 5% per year. But if you took out 5% starting in 2000, i.e. the 50,000, if you took out the 5%, you wrecked your retirement in year 16 or 17. I can't remember which point it was. How does that, you've got to walk me through,
Sure.
Grant. How does that happen?
So in the distribution, what matters most is that you're taking out your dollars tax efficiently and you're managing points of volatility. So the reason this happens and the reason we can see it on a chart is because when you're taking dollars out and the market is going down or it's hitting low points, even if it comes back and rockets back like we saw back in March, April of 2020, The dollars you take out at the bottom don't have an opportunity to grow back up when the market rebounds. So you've solidified the loss in your dollars at that point in time. And so that's why we have to control standard of living. We have to control risk. We have to understand how taxes work, because that plays all into the equation of making sure that $1 million, that example, lasts longer than 19 years. Or I'm sorry, 16 years. I apologize.
So one of the frustrating parts for me has always been people say that when you get to a certain age, you need to take less risk. And that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because we don't really know what risk is. Risk by definition is when you get something different than what you expect. And what I've challenged Grant to do, and you that have listened to the show for years, is describe for me a situation where you can use the word risk that doesn't have a negative outcome. And it's why we don't know if it was FDR or if it was a speechwriter, but somebody in 1933, 34 was bright enough to interchange the word speculation, because the stock market is speculative, right? It can either go higher than you expect or lower than you expect. And they interchanged the word risk, and that's because they needed money back in the banks. And so a lot of people have a misunderstanding of how that volatility works. And because we are at the age we are, and because we've seen a market work so well for so long, I think a lot of people are out there, Grant, that have a view that they can take out that 5%, that they can take out, if they know mathematically they've averaged 8% for 20 years, why can't they take out 8% today?
Right.
And until you understand what Grant walked you through with that S&P 500 example, you will wreck your retirement. The younger you are, the lower percentage that we will recommend you take out of your assets on an annual basis, because you have an increased probability to an economic dislocation, whether that's a pandemic or a 2008, 2009, whether it's, God forbid, 9/11 all over again, right? But we've got to protect your retirement. The only way that you can do that is to have a disciplined program and an understanding of how that distribution process works. Go to yourlifeafterwork.com. Get signed up for your Next Steps meeting. Grant will sit down with you, or one of the advisors on our team. He'll give you things to consider today, things you're going to want to consider in the future, and if we choose to partner together, what FEG will do for you, and he'll put it in writing.